Hello, hello. I hope you're well and Happy New Year. If you're in a part of the world that, points to January 1st as the beginning of the new year, then Happy New Year to you. That's my little party favor. You're welcome. Oh gosh, in all seriousness, thanks for joining. And if you're new to all of this, and maybe this is the first episode that you've taken on, well, then I'll just tell you what I'm doing here. This is now officially into the second year of this project, and this project is me reading a book that I have really been enjoying, and I hope you have too. So this is a reading of On the Path, an anthology on the Noble Eightfold Path, drawn from the Pāli Canon. And this book was written by Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu, who is an American Theravāda Buddhist monk, and he's widely respected for his translations of Buddhist texts and his teachings on meditation and the Dhamma. And we are actively, and have been in the last couple of episodes, in Chapter 4, in Right Resolve. And I'd say that if you're interested in what is oftentimes in Buddhism presented as the first, quote-unquote right in the Noble Eightfold Path right view, go back and listen to other episodes where I read about that, and you'll maybe notice how much time Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu spent on right view. And I talk about why I'm glad that he did, and why I think really on an experiential level, recognizing right view, I know for me it was really kind of paramount to my being able to find Buddhism useful, and actually, shaping, even though I have my struggles, but it may not be recognizable to everyone, because, anyone who knows me knows I'm not the life of the party, but I'm quite content in my life. Even among and amidst all the things, I'm quite content. And it's not just Buddhism that I have to thank for that, which I've talked about. I've had many years of therapy and 2 decades of a 12-step program, a couple of different 12-step programs, lots of different things operating in my life that have helped me to come to contentment. I'm not suggesting that contentment should be your aim. This podcast is really kind of a diary, actually, more than anything else. It's why my comments are off and all the things. I just wanted to talk a little bit about, or share, put out into the world, vis-a-vis the YouTubes, why I sometimes to the point of clinging, and I have to be very mindful and work with that a lot. It comes and goes in waves, I've noticed. But I'm quite committed to, working with the Eightfold Path. Committed does not mean that I follow it perfectly, as I've talked about. I'm not. But it is kind of my compass. It's my moral compass. It's my kind of common sense compass. It's my psychological compass. It's my sociology and anthropological compass. It is my compass. It's my true north. And this reading began in a Discord server. And now I've just kind of continued it on my own, and I've really been enjoying it, really enjoying it. So anyway, that's enough of that. Welcome. And if you do have the book, it is a free book. So if you expand out the description of each video, you'll see a link to the free book. And again, I want to thank Ṭhānissaro Bhikkhu for putting this in the Creative Commons, which means that I can do what I'm doing with this podcast without paying royalties. So thank you so much for that, sir. And let's get back into the book. And so we are about midway down in the page on page 259, and we're beginning with Sutta 147. There are these 5 strings of sensuality. Which 5? Forms cognizable via the eye, agreeable, pleasing, charming, endearing, enticing, linked to sensual desire. Sounds cognizable via the ear. Aromas, cognizable via the nose. Flavors, cognizable via the tongue. Tactile sensations, cognizable via the body. Agreeable, pleasing, charming, endearing, enticing, linked to sensual desire. But these are not sensuality. They are called strings of sensuality in the discipline of the noble ones. The passion for his resolves is a man's sensuality, not the beautiful sensual pleasures found in the world. The passion for his resolves is a man's sensuality. The beauties remain as they are in the world, while in this regard, the enlightened subdue their desire. And that comes from AN 6:63. So I find this really interesting here. So as you know, if you listen to the podcast, I reiterate, I'm not a scholar. I'm not a monk. I've never been ordained. This is really a part of my practice, doing this reading and just kind of talking about what it means for me. So, if you're really interested in Buddhism, I hope that you are not using me as your primary source, because I am not an appropriate primary source, I would say. But Robot tells me that this comes from Anguttara Nikaya 663. And it's really interesting because he begins the sutta with outlining the strings of sensuality that have been talked about before. What's agreeable or disagreeable to our eyes, what's agreeable or disagreeable to, our sounds, what sounds agreeable or disagreeable, what smell is agreeable or disagreeable, etc., etc. But then he very directly, very explicitly says, but these are not sensuality. Really interesting. Really interesting. So what is sensuality? It's how the string of sensuality is how we relate. It's the Buddha suggesting that sensuality is that pull toward experiencing more. And it's the investment, the excitement, the anticipation that we work up and build up in the body that can then create conditions for a compulsive relationship with all of that. The compulsion to secure it so that you can repeat it, so that you can control it. That is sensuality, says the Buddha. So the object, what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're smelling, what we're tasting, what we're feeling, etc., that doesn't change. That is not sensuality. We change. We change. We create expectations. We create agreements, contracts with what greets those sense gates. That's sensuality, says the Buddha here. The beauties remain as they are in the world, while in this regard the enlightened subdue their desire. And so, again, I'm no scholar, but this is a very radical way of being with the world. Really, really radical. Buddha is really asking us to, he's not asking us to relinquish the experiential world. He's not asking us to give that up here. He's not saying that the experiential world is the problem. He's saying it very specifically here. It's not. The world will continue to be vivid. It will continue to be. Beauty, all of it, it will continue to be. We resolve to relinquish ownership of experience. It's mine. I want to keep this. I want to recreate this. This is really, really difficult for me here. And as I've mentioned before, I don't presently have a teacher, but I really am looking forward to finding one. I feel that where I live, sensuality has really strange connotations, and it's often confused with sex. Sensuality and sexuality are confused, and they're not the same thing. We're really getting into the weeds of what sensuality is in Buddhism here in this sutta, and for me, what I like to do with this idea is to really get, try to get at, okay, what experience am I really trying to defend or deny? That's where the rubber meets the road, I find in my life, the thing that hurts the most, that is the largest pain point for me. And can I apply this idea of, so how am I appropriating this experience here? Managing it, trying to manage it, make it be different, And it can feel like moralizing. But again, if you've listened to earlier episodes, if I am wrong about Buddhism, and I'm pretty sure in this regard I'm not, and I think that you could ask anyone anywhere who practices Buddhism if I'm wrong, and they'll agree that I am not wrong on this one. That Buddha is not moralizing on this. This is not about a moral purity test, living in sin or not living in sin. That's not the language that the Buddha used. That's not the psychology of Buddhism. So this sutta right here, it aligns directly with 3 core early Buddhist ideas: dependent origination, non-identity, and the middle way. What the Buddha is suggesting here is that the key here is to relinquish the belief that satisfaction can be secured through experience. That is the trap. I hope I did justice and right by that sutta, and I'm gonna keep going. Sutta 148. If one, longing for sensual pleasure, achieves it, yes, he's enraptured at heart. The mortal gets what he wants. But if for that person, longing, desire, the pleasures diminish, he's afflicted, as if shot with an arrow. Whoever avoids sensual desires as he would with his foot the head of a snake goes beyond mindful. This attachment in the world, a man who is greedy for fields, land, gold, cattle, horses, servants, employees, women, relatives, many sensual pleasures, is overpowered with weakness and trampled by trouble, for pain invades him as water a cracked boat. So one, always mindful, should avoid sensual desires. Letting them go, he'd cross over the flood, like one who, having bailed out the boat, has reached the far shore. And that comes from SN4:1. So I just want to begin by sharing here that I really wanted to try to penetrate this as much as I could. And the only way that I can do that is to just try to understand it, to really try to access it. So I went through several rounds here of Buddhist trained AI, and finally I was getting so frustrated that I just said, look, man, just pretend that I'm a very wise 5-year-old. Unpack this sutta for me. And I enjoyed what it wrote so much that I'm going to read it to you verbatim now. So here is what Robot had to say. So Robot says, number 1, the Buddha notices one basic pattern. Sometimes you want something. You get it. You feel good. Then it changes or goes away or stops working. And then you hurt. You scramble. You get tight. You want it back, or you want something else. So he notices this happens over and over, no matter how smart a person is. Pretty good so far, right? Certainly also my understanding of what he's saying here. So this is just, I'm loving this. So here, Robot has 9 points here. So that was number 1. Number 2, he looks carefully and asks, where exactly does the hurt start? He checks. Is it the thing? No, the thing just sits there. Is it seeing, hearing, tasting? No. Senses just do their job. Is it feeling good? No. Feeling good feels good. What he sees is this. The hurt starts when the mind says, I need this. This should last. This is mine. That move, that squeeze, that's what he calls craving. Number 3. Big discovery. This part matters, Robot says. He notices something uncomfortable. Even when people understand this, they still do the squeeze. They can say, I know this won't last. I know this causes suffering. I've seen this pattern before. And still, the squeeze happens. So he learns, knowing the rule does not stop the reflex. That's important. That's not stupid. That's just how nervous systems work. Yeah, I'm really digging this. Right on, Robot. So that was number 3. Number 4. So he separates 2 questions. And here Robot says, this is the key. He keeps these very separate, even though readers mash them together. So here I'm so confused. Here Robot says, question A, what actually causes the problem? Answer, the squeezing, the craving. Question B, if the squeezing is still there, what makes it happen more? Answer, certain situations, certain setups, certain toys. gold, sex, status, ownership, being needed, being admired, being secure forever. Not because they're evil, but because they're really good at making the squeeze start. This is just fabulous. Okay, so now we're up to 5. So Robot says, so why does he say avoid this stuff? He is Buddha. Not because the world is bad, pleasure is bad, people are dumb, you can't understand, but because he's saying if the reflex is still alive, don't keep poking it. That's it. Number 6. What does ordinary mind mean, really? This is in response to a longer conversation that I had with Robot, who was answering me in kind of a stiff, very kind of doctrinal way. And I wanted it to speak in a more kind of more logos, more logical way. Just so anyway, I won't bore you with my whole thread. But here the Robot's giving me Buddha, robot, he, she, they, he, ooh, Okay, so here Robot, number 6, says, what does ordinary mind mean really? And that is an answer to my question when Robot said that most people with ordinary mind, okay, so that's what's the context. It does not mean average intelligence, naive person, unspiritual person, morally flawed person. It means only this, a mind where the squeeze still turns on by itself. That's it. One switch, says Robot. If the switch can still flip, ordinary mind. If the switch is permanently gone, not ordinary. And here the Robot says, so what the Buddha really suggested, his kind of approach, what kind of his claim when he was alive and teaching, is that a human can see a pattern perfectly well and still be trapped by it unless the reflex itself is dismantled. That's it. Number 8. So what does this mean to you? Robot's saying to me, to us. It does not mean that we should renounce the world, avoid pleasure, obey the Buddha, accept the Buddhas. Robot puts here pessimism. Interesting word choice for Robot. Puts the word here as pessimism. I find that an interesting choice. I don't find the Buddhist views particularly pessimistic. To me, that's kind of a negative view, and almost implies a more Western kind of view of it, which is not surprising. So it means this single question is now on the table. Do you believe insight alone is strong enough to override desire in real time? The Buddha says usually no, and as someone who struggled with addiction, bulimia, and all the things, I would say, speaking for myself, I would agree. Do I believe that insight alone is strong enough to override my desires in real time? No, not from my experience. And that's why the practice is so core and so key for me personally. And then finally, Robot says, number 9, final sentence, as simple as it gets, Robot says, to explain it to the very wise 5-year-old. The Buddha isn't saying you're too dumb to get it. He's saying even when you get it, the reflex still runs. So change the conditions until it doesn't. So there you go. I don't really have anything else to say about that. I'm just going to keep on reading. Looking forward to sitting with that and thinking about that long and hard. Happy to be that 5-year-old. I don't know how much wisdom I have, but happy to be that 5-year-old today, Robot. So yeah, let's keep going. Sutta 149. Now what, monks, is the allure of sensuality? These 5 strings of sensuality. Which 5? Forms cognizable via the eye, agreeable, pleasing, charming, endearing, enticing, linked to sensual desire. Sounds cognizable via the ear. And then he has an ellipses. Aromas cognizable via the nose, ellipses. Flavors cognizable via the tongue, ellipses. Tactile sensations cognizable via the body. Agreeable, pleasing, charming, endearing, enticing, linked to sensual desire. Now, whatever pleasure or happiness arises in dependence on these 5 strings of sensuality, that is the allure of sensuality. And what is the drawback of sensuality? There's the case where, on account of the occupation by which a clansman makes a living, whether checking or accounting or calculating or plowing or trading or cattle tending or archery, or as a kingsman, or whatever the occupation may be, he faces cold, he faces heat, being harassed by mosquitoes and flies, wind and sun and creeping things, dying from hunger and thirst. Now, this drawback in the case of sensuality, this mass of stress visible here and now, has sensuality for its reason, sensuality for its source, sensuality for its cause, the reason being simply sensuality. If the clansman gains no wealth while thus working and striving and making effort, he sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. My work is in vain. My efforts are fruitless. If the clansman gains wealth while thus working and striving and making effort, he experiences pain and distress in protecting it. How will neither kings nor thieves make off with my property, nor fire burn it, nor water sweep it away, nor hateful airs make off with it? And as he thus guards and watches over his property, kings or thieves make off with it, or fire burns it, or water sweeps it away, or hateful airs make off with it, and he sorrows, grieves, and laments, beats his breast, becomes distraught. What was mine is no more. Again, it is with sensuality for the reason, sensuality for the source, sensuality for the cause. The reason being simply sensuality, that kings quarrel with kings, nobles with nobles, Brahmins with Brahmins, householders with householders, mother with child, child with mother, father with child, child with father, brother with brother, sister with sister, brother with sister, sister with brother, friend with friend. And then in their quarrels, brawls, and disputes, they attack one another with fists, or with clods, or with sticks, or with knives, so that they incur death or deadly pain. Ellipses. Again, it is with sensuality for the reason, sensuality for the source, that, and then in parentheses, men, taking swords and shields and buckling on bows and quivers, charge into battle, massed in double array, while arrows and spears are flying and swords are flashing. And there they are, wounded by arrows and spears, and their heads are cut off by swords, so that they incur death or deadly pain. Ellipses. Again, it is with sensuality for the reason, sensuality for the source, that, parentheses, men, taking swords and shields, buckling on bows and quivers, charge slippery bastions, while arrows and spears are flying, and swords are flashing. And there they are, splashed with boiling cow dung, and crushed under heavy weights, and their heads are cut off by swords, so that they incur death or deadly pain. Ellipses. Again, it is with sensuality for the reason, sensuality for the source, that, parentheses, men break into windows, seize, plunder, commit burglary, ambush highways, commit adultery, and when they are captured, kings have them tortured in many ways. They flog them with whips, beat them with canes, beat them with clubs. They cut off their hands, cut off their feet, cut off their hands and feet. They cut off their ears, cut off their noses, cut off their ears and noses. They subject them to many graphic tortures. They have them splashed with boiling oil, devoured by dogs, impaled alive on stakes. They have their heads cut off with swords, so that they incur death or deadly pain. Now this drawback too, in the case of sensuality, this mass of stress visible here and now, has sensuality for its reason, sensuality for its source, sensuality for its cause, the reason being simply sensuality. Again, it is with sensuality for the reason, sensuality for the source, that, parentheses, people engage in bodily misconduct, verbal misconduct, mental misconduct. Having engaged in bodily, verbal, and mental misconduct, they, on the breakup of the body after death, reappear in a plane of deprivation, a bad destination, a lower realm, hell. Now this drawback too, in the case of sensuality, this mass of stress in the future life, has sensuality for its reason, sensuality for its source, sensuality for its cause, the reason being simply sensuality. And that comes from MN 13. Wow. So there is a whole lot to unpack here. Once again, I'll do my best. Beginning with my attempt to pronounce this. This comes from, apparently, so please fact check me, the Mahadukkha Kahanda Sutta. Mahadukkha Kahanda Sutta. I hope I did okay there. The Great Mass of Stress Sutta. And so obviously it's preceding the definition of sensuality that the Buddha laid out in the previous two suttas. So what is he now doing here? So to my view, those previous suttas provided a really good context for this one in terms of explaining to me, the reader, what sensuality means in Buddhism. So in this sutta, he's saying when people, and he has men in parentheses a couple times, and then he has people, and that's really interesting too. But hey, that's who was making the war and leading the people, men. When people organize their lives around getting and keeping desirable things, violence will predictably follow. It's just the way of things. Scarcity plus craving plus identity equals conflict. It's just, again, it's causal. It's causal. The Buddha is making a claim here. This is causal. This is basic cause and effect. Scarcity plus craving plus identity equals conflict, period. And he provides, he provides very specific, explicit examples of exactly how much suffering can occur, can be downstream of attachment to sensual pleasures. And so he's making a really harsh statement here, a really harsh claim, stripping away everything. When you have competition for land, resources, in his time, and still today in some cultures, women, labor, security, prestige, when you're in competition for that, violence will follow. So, So he shocked the readers to really kind of bring it home. And then the sutta resolves with the foundational cosmological aspects of Buddhism. Definitely a piece that is left in Western culture. I understand. I absolutely understand why it was done. I don't want to say I wish it hadn't been done. I wish it would have been honest. How about that? I wish I would have been honest with the realities of what the Buddha was saying. Because there's a lot of cosmology here. And as I've mentioned in plenty of other episodes, how I feel about this notion that our actions in this life will create our birth in the next, and whether or not that even exists, this idea of, my relationship to that is that I have no idea what happens after I die. Absolutely none. I don't know that anybody really knows what happens after we die. I don't even really know that I'm particularly interested in knowing what happens after I die. I think I've always kind of conceived of my death, even when I don't know, I guess as the next adventure or nothingness. I have no idea, and I'm really, really, really comfortable actually with not knowing. Maybe that's because of the experiences I've had, which I've talked about in other episodes. I have no idea. But I will say when it comes to the cosmology of Buddhism, rather than leaving it out, I prefer to say I don't know, and it is part of the original teachings. And so I want to honor it. And so I'm certainly not going to leave it out, and I'm not going to, I'm not going to change Buddhism to make other people more comfortable. Yeah, and that is a key part of Buddhism, so there you go. Yeah, so we pursue desirable things. Desirable things are limited. Now here's where, we're living in a really, it's just so fascinating to me, because of what the bent of my new career. I have a lot of people in my life and in my sphere of influence right now who are very, very excited about, kind of an abundance mindset. And this is actually very, very key in, for instance, you've heard me talk about, the Church of Religious Science, Theosophy, abundance. And I love this idea. I really, really do. I love the idea of abundance. The tricky part, I would say, with that frame is that unless everybody just kind of has some monumental, maybe psychic break at the same time or something, I don't know. We don't live in an abundant society. That's just the reality. Like for instance, if you're living in the world, maybe you're living under a particular political regime, maybe there are deep, profound cultural beliefs around certain conditions, like the gender or the sex that one was born into, or when that exists, there is no freedom, there is no abundance. When I think of what I've read about the abundance mindset, the law of attraction, for instance, to me is a stellar and recognizable example of an abundance mindset. It implicitly assumes some things that are just objectively false. It suggests that it's not desire that is a problem, that scarcity is mostly psychological or socially constructed. It believes that if people stopped believing resources were scarce, that competition would soften. And that with enough reframing, kind of reframing and reteaching humans, cooperation will replace rivalry, conflict, all of the awful things that the Buddha just presented to us. But there's a hidden assumption here, and I think it's one that matters. Desire can be safely expanded without recognizing social reality in that framework. In fact, I would argue that it encourages you to not consider social reality at all as a component. So I have to be honest, the abundance mindset feels naive to me. It feels like denial of reality. And MN 13 here is saying, you don't escape the consequences of craving by changing your attitude if the world still runs on possession, hierarchy, and competition. So this is a very fine line here that I'm walking, and I realize it. And for people who are really into the law of attraction, hey, you know what? This is my view, right? These are my opinions. And I definitely have worked with the law of attraction when I was in my 20s, and I definitely, and it's really cool. And I've read loads of books and all the things. And it doesn't quite line up for me at this juncture in my life for the reasons that I'm laying out now. So to my view, the Buddha's not saying that, abundance doesn't exist, or that he's saying it's fragile. It's very fragile, and it's owned. The reality is that it's owned. Abundance really only works when our needs are modest, our populations are small, power is diffuse, desire is voluntarily restrained. Once any of those break, mindset can't carry the load. I mean, for the reasons that the Buddha just laid out in previous suttas. So really, MN 13 is rejecting abundance as a universal solution. Doesn't necessarily have to be a rejection for you personally. There's so many aspects of what I've learned from the law of attraction and the Church of Religious Science and some of these new American religions that came out of the late 1800s and the early like the Edwardian period, really, which were largely influenced by Eastern ideas. But MN 13 is wholly rejecting the abundance mindset as a cure for our social and universal ails for the reasons that were already outlined. Abundance mindset says wanting doesn't have to turn into violence. And MN 13 is saying history shows that it usually does. Plain and simple. It's kind of, he's saying, look, though. So I really do. I think the abundance mindset is beautiful. I think it's psychologically generous and very personally stabilizing. But when I read MN 13 here, what I see is a refusal to pretend that mindset alone can override material limits. The sutta isn't anti-joy. It's not anti-denial. It's just saying, follow desire all the way out into land, power, sex, labor, and security, and you don't get harm. And you historically, objectively, as he was looking around, outlining all of these horrors to us in this sutta, you don't get harmony. You get conflict. And so internally, abundance might feel very real and great. But the world still has edges. It still has sharp points. And when desire hits those edges, people are going to bleed. And that's just called life. So to my view, MN 13 forces us to ask whether abundance thinking is honest about power, scarcity, and violence, or really whether it quietly assumes a world that doesn't exist. And I think that's a question worth asking. I'm glad that the Buddha asked it 2,600 years ago. I think it's a good question. Yeah. I'm going to keep on going. Okay. Sutta 150. Householder. Suppose a dog, overcome with weakness and hunger, were to come across a slaughterhouse, and there a dexterous butcher or butcher's apprentice were to fling him a chain of bones, thoroughly scraped, without any flesh, smeared with blood. What do you think? Would the dog, gnawing on that chain of bones, thoroughly scraped without any flesh, smeared with blood, appease its weakness and hunger? No, Lord. And why is that? Because the chain of bones is thoroughly scraped without any flesh and smeared with blood. The dog would get nothing but its share of weariness and vexation. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to a chain of bones, of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it actually is, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness. And then in brackets, according to MN 137, this means equanimity based on the 4 formless attainments, where sustenance clinging for the baits of the world ceases without trace. Now suppose a vulture, a kite, or a hawk, seizing a lump of flesh, were to take off, and other vultures, kites, or hawks, following right after it, were to tear at it with their beaks and pull at it with their claws. What do you think? If that vulture, kite, or hawk were not quickly to drop that lump of flesh, would it meet with death from that cause, or with death-like pain? Yes, Lord. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to a lump of flesh, of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it actually is, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance clinging for the baits of the world ceases without trace. Now suppose a man were to come against the wind, carrying a burning grass torch. What do you think? If he were not quickly to drop that grass torch, would he burn his hand or his arm or some other part of his body, so that he would meet with death from that cause or with death-like pain? Yes, Lord. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to a grass torch of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it actually is, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance clinging for the baits of the world ceases without trace. Now suppose there were a pit of glowing embers, deeper than a man's height, full of embers that were neither flaming nor smoking, and a man were to come along, loving life, hating death, loving pleasure, abhorring pain, and 2 strong men, grabbing him with their arms, were to drag him to the pit of embers. What do you think? Wouldn't the man twist his body this way and that? Yes, Lord. And why is that? Because he would realize, if I fall into this pit of glowing embers, I will meet with death from that cause, or with death-like pain. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to a pit of glowing embers of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it actually is, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance, clinging for the baits of the world, ceases without trace. Now suppose a man, when dreaming, were to see delightful parks, delightful forests, delightful stretches of land, and delightful lakes, and on awakening were to see nothing. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to a dream of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it actually is, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance clinging for the baits of the world ceases without trace. Now suppose a man, having borrowed some goods, a manly carriage, fine jewels, and ear ornaments, were to go into the market preceded and surrounded by his borrowed goods, and people seeing him would say, "How wealthy this man is." For this is how the wealthy enjoy their possessions. But the actual owners, wherever they might see him, would strip him then and there of what is theirs. What do you think? Would the man justifiably be upset? No, Lord. And why is that? Because the owners are stripping him of what is theirs. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to borrowed goods of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it actually is, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance clinging for the baits of the world ceases without trace. Now suppose that, not far from a village or town, there was a dense forest grove, and there in the grove was a tree with delicious fruit, abundant fruit, but with no fruit fallen to the ground. A man would come along desiring fruit, looking for fruit, searching for fruit. Plunging into the forest grove, he would see the tree, and the thought would occur to him, "This is a tree with delicious fruit, abundant fruit, and there is no fruit fallen to the ground. But I know how to climb a tree. Why don't I climb the tree, eat what I like, and fill my clothes with the fruit?" So having climbed the tree, he would eat what he liked and fill his clothes with the fruit. Then a second man would come along, desiring fruit, looking for fruit, searching for fruit, and carrying a sharp axe. Plunging into the forest grove, he would see the tree, and the thought would occur to him, "This is a tree with delicious fruit, abundant fruit, and there is no fruit fallen to the ground. And I don't know how to climb a tree. Why don't I chop down this tree at the root, eat what I like, and fill my clothes with the fruit?" So he would chop the tree at the root. What do you think? If the first man who climbed the tree didn't quickly come down, wouldn't the falling tree crush his hand or foot or some other part of his body, so that he would meet with death from that cause or with death-like pain? Yes, Lord. In the same way, householder, a disciple of the Noble Ones considers this point. The Blessed One has compared sensuality to the fruits of a tree, of much stress, much despair, and greater drawbacks. Seeing this with right discernment, as it actually is present, then avoiding the equanimity coming from multiplicity, dependent on multiplicity, he develops the equanimity coming from singleness, dependent on singleness, where sustenance clinging for the habits, for the baits of the world ceases without trace. And that comes from MN 54. All right. Well, as I always say, I'm really enjoying this. And I've also really quite taken with the idea of any time I want to make sure, which is often, I want to make sure that I'm doing this justice, that I'm understanding it as intended. Then I'll tap into AI that's trained on Buddhism, and I'll use prompts like, as if I was 5, and it comes back with just fantastic explanations that are just, I find really useful. So I'll read some of this to you, but also, just to spare you from all of that. But I think at the end of the day, this sutta is really about how there is so much, both internally and externally, that seemingly appears that it would make us really happy. And yeah, perhaps while we have it, it would, I don't know. Like, for instance, there are some I can speak to with knowledge. I can say that, like, for instance, I'm married, and I'm really glad that I'm with my partner, and so I can speak to that. That my relationship with my husband makes me very, very happy. And then one day, one of us is going to go first, and then what happens to my happiness? I've never been a millionaire. I've never been wealthy. So I don't know what kind of, quote, happiness money brings. Very contingent kind of happiness, or can, maybe it doesn't feel contingent if you were born into it, but it is. Even though some systems will, never have to worry about it, the Trumps of the world. But it is, it is a very transient kind of happiness, in this sutta, the Buddha's suggesting, are we really happy? Are we sure? He's suggesting, isn't all of this wanting and the feeding of the wanting and the wanting and the feeding of the wanting? We can create all kinds of drama around it if and when it disappears. And it will disappear. I mean, maybe it won't disappear, again, going back to Trump, going back to, Mark Zuckerberg will never have to worry about losing his money, right? That's not a thing that's probably going to happen to Mark Zuckerberg. So he won't have to deal with that that transient human-contrived property in this lifetime. So it might feel really kind of out there in the ether somewhere. But the Buddha is suggesting all of this is transient. And I think people who are extremely wealthy, but who are diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, they get to see how their money can't help them, how cancer doesn't care about their money, for instance. So yeah, this kind of idea that the things that look like they'll make us happy, are you sure that that's that kind of groundless kind of thing? Are you sure that that's really where you want to get it from? This is my interpretation here. But then AI, here, let me share with you what Robot had to say about, the metaphors that Buddha here is using, in relationship to the dog gnawing on a bone that just doesn't really have anything on it. And then the birds coming in and fighting over the strip of bone with the meat and the thing. So, it's pretty clear in the writing, but in case you're a wise 5-year-old, this is what Robot said. 1, a very hungry dog finds some bones. They smell good. They look promising, but there's no meat. The dog chews and chews and gets nothing, just sore gums and frustration. Meaning, some pleasures look like food for happiness, but there's nothing there. You chase them, chew on them, and end up tired and disappointed. I think that anyone who is exploring Buddhist ideas for themselves could just have a lot of fun with Robot here. But what if I won $1 million and I subjectively can tell you that I feel much happier? What about that, Buddha? And that's a great question, and I encourage you maybe, I don't know. The whole AI thing and the resources and all this stuff. And, there's so much going on there. At any rate, there's a lot of arguments that anyone could make, against this, especially if they have subjectively experienced happiness because they suddenly inherited a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What arises for me, if anybody were to come back with that argument, is I would love to do a longitudinal study on that person because I believe it. If I was to interview someone a couple months after they just won $2 million, and prior to that they were living paycheck to paycheck, renting a house in Los Angeles, trying to feed a family of 4 on a 2-figure a year salary, yeah, I am quite certain, from my view, in my opinion, that if I was to interview them, the whole family, let's just interview the whole family, individual interviews, the whole family, a month or so later, that they would report feeling incredibly happy, relieved, just relieved that they no longer have to worry about things that were just objectively causing them great anxiety, stress, unhappiness, depression possibly. But I'd like to continue interviewing them over time, maybe a year later, 2 years later, 3 years later, to ask them whether or not they're happy, to maybe actually use some measurement tool, self-reported happiness. And do they still feel happy? It's really interesting. There's been a lot of research on this done already, and I don't really feel like looking it up right now, but you can certainly do it, about people whose external circumstances like that radically changed and how, longitudinally over time, they didn't change. Their relationship to life didn't change. That to me is, us chewing on a bone. The meat in this particular situation would be that $2 million lottery, whatever, check. And that meat's there for a while, and it's great, it's really, really great. It's really, really great if that's where we're looking to garner our power. Then yeah, and then the birds fighting over, and then let's get to the number 2, what Robot has to say about the birds, right? A bird grabs a piece of meat and flies away. So there you go. A Other birds chase it, they attack it, they tear at it. If the bird doesn't drop the meat, it gets badly hurt or killed. So here Robot says the meaning of that is when you cling to things everyone wants, status, sex, praise, money, you invite conflict, stress, fear, and harm. Sometimes the safest thing is to let go. Again, this is a path. There's so many arguments that can be made against this, and yeah, they're awesome arguments, I'm sure, I think this is a really, I think this is a pretty logical argument as well, I think there's a lot of logos behind this argument, regardless of whether and again, I realize I can't speak from a subjective experience about being wealthy, but I suspect there are a lot of very, very wealthy people in the world who are dead inside. My feeling on Epstein, actually. That's kind of my view of Epstein. I remember when all of that was kind of going on, and it's still going on, right? The release of the Epstein files is still just like, come on, you guys, release the Epstein files. But I was following that case, and then when the photos came out, and I was seeing all these photos in this guy's house, and I was thinking, wow, man, here's a guy who's just really dead inside. To my view, this is to my view, I can't even imagine being that dead inside, actually. That okay with cruelty, is pretty radical to me anyway. But those status games, when you're playing those games, I don't know, maybe Epstein was really happy, maybe, who knows? Maybe I'm sure that there are people in the world who take great pleasure from being quite cruel, perhaps they get all of their pleasure from being cruel. I've certainly met them. I've certainly met them when I was young, And I from a Buddhist view, that would be karmic seeds ripening. I'm not a scholar. I don't understand the weeds there. I don't profoundly understand what their view is about, why that mind exists. Why that mind exists. The mind who derives pleasure from being cruel is it's pretty trippy to me. It's a real trip. As I said earlier, even I know when to not, be open, especially when you're a woman, It's like, yeah, just love everybody and be open. Bullshit, man. What are you talking about? Are you insane? Anyway, I've gone way off the rails, but let me come back to the whole sutta here. And I think I'm way off the rails because I'm now recording this part right here, the commentary on this sutta, like 3 days after I started recording this. So we'll see if I keep this in. But at any rate, that's kind of what's going on there, to my understanding. That if you hearken back to earlier sections of the book, earlier episodes, I don't remember which episode this was, and I don't remember which pages these were on, but it was in Right View, and it was talking about fire, water, earth, air, what was space? I'm trying to think of all the properties. I may have left out some. But this is what's coming to mind, where the Buddha is talking about, the kind of the internal manifestation of these properties and the external manifestation of these properties, and the ember. Thinking about this idea of the ember that that the Buddha is talking about here, the pit of hot embers or the burning torch. Both of these are they're specifically drawing on the property of fire. And again, if you were to go back and look at the Buddhist view of fire and kind of how fire works. It's fascinating to think about it, from that perspective when you're now looking at these analogies, right? In this, to my view, in this particular sutta. And so here's what Robot had to say about, Buddha's analogy, the burning torch. A man walks into the wind holding a burning torch, fire, a burning torch. The flame blows back toward him. The nature of fire, again, going back and looking at the fire property. If he doesn't drop it, he burns himself badly. That's just the reality, the nature of fire, right? Like fire doesn't care about your house. Fire doesn't care about your family. Fire doesn't care about your money. Fire doesn't care about your job. Fire doesn't care about your wedding. Fire doesn't care about your new puppy. Fire doesn't care about your new car. Fire doesn't care about your plans tonight. Fire doesn't, right? It's that kind of, the person twists and struggles with everything they've got to hang on to the torch. Why? Because falling in it would be unbearable. And so here Robot says the meaning of this is, some pleasures actively hurt you while you're holding them, and the longer you cling, the worse it burns. Some pleasures actively hurt us while we're holding them, And the more we cling, the more it burns. You know, Robot has a whole lot more to say on this, but I don't know. That just feels like the end for me right there about the sutta in terms of what its function is here. And again, I'm not a scholar, but it feels settled for me. So I think I'm just going to keep on reading. Yeah, let's do it. Sutta 151. Magandhya. Suppose that there was a leper covered with sores and infections, devoured by worms, picking the scabs of the openings of his wounds with his nails, cauterizing his body over a pit of glowing embers. His friends, companions, and relatives would take him to a doctor. The doctor would concoct medicine for him, and thanks to the medicine, he would be cured of his leprosy, well and happy, free, master of himself, going wherever he liked. Then suppose two strong men, having seized hold of him by both arms, were to drag him to a pit of glowing embers. What do you think? Wouldn't he twist his body this way and that? Yes, Master Gotama. Why is that? The fire is painful to the touch, very hot and scorching. Now what do you think, Magandhya? Is the fire painful to the touch, very hot and scorching only now? Or was it also that way before? Both now and before is it painful to the touch, very hot and scorching, Master Gotama. It's just that when the man was a leper covered with sores and infections, devoured by worms, picking the scabs of the openings of his wounds with his nails, his faculties were impaired, which was why, even though the fire was actually painful to the touch, he had the skewed perception of pleasant. In the same way, Magandhya, sensual pleasures in the past were painful to the touch, very hot and scorching. Sensual pleasures in the future will be painful to the touch, very hot and scorching. Sensual pleasures at present are painful to the touch, very hot and scorching. But when beings are not free from passion for sensual pleasures, devoured by sensual craving, burning with sensual fever, their faculties are impaired, which is why, even though sensual pleasures are actually painful to the touch, they have the skewed perception of pleasant. Now suppose that there was a leper covered with sores and infections, devoured by worms, picking the scabs of the openings of his wounds with his nails, cauterizing his body over a pit of glowing embers. The more he cauterized his body over the pit of glowing embers, the more disgusting, foul-smelling, and putrid the openings of his wounds would become. And yet he would feel a modicum of enjoyment and satisfaction because of the itchiness of his wounds. In the same way, beings not free from passion for sensual pleasures, devoured by sensual craving, burning with sensual fever, indulge in sensual pleasures. The more they indulge in sensual pleasures, the more their sensual craving increases, and the more they burn with sensual fever, and yet they feel a modicum of enjoyment and satisfaction, dependent on the 5 strings of sensuality. Now what do you think, Magandhya? Have you ever seen or heard of a king or a king's minister enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the 5 strings of sensuality, without abandoning sensual craving, without removing sensual fever? Who has dwelt or will dwell or is dwelling free from thirst, his mind inwardly at peace? No, Master Gotama. Very good, Magandhya. Neither have I ever seen or heard of a king or king's minister enjoying himself, provided and endowed with the 5 strings of sensuality, without abandoning sensual craving, without removing sensual fever. Who has dwelt or will dwell or is dwelling free from thirst, his mind inwardly at peace. But whatever contemplatives or Brahmins who have dwelt or will dwell or are dwelling free from thirst, their minds inwardly at peace, all have done so having realized, as it has come to be, the origination and disappearance, the allure, the danger, and the escape from sensual pleasures, having abandoned sensual craving and removed sensual fever. And that comes from MN 75. And so here in this sutta, I'm getting my question answered. You know, earlier I said it's hard for me to comprehend a mind like Epstein's mind, or anyone who would do such great harm. And this sutta explains it. And, you know, I love the idea that the Buddha here is, beginning with the idea of a leper. So somebody who is already quite afflicted. And, he goes into a lot of detail about what his affliction looked like, smelled like, and the lengths that he went to soothe his affliction. And so where I perceive emptiness inside, the Buddha would suggest, and this is my understanding of this sutta here, again, this is my interpretation, not an expert, that a mind like that is what a mind looks like when its perception is so distorted by craving that pain registers as pleasure. This is where I think a lot, there's been so much discussion about whether or not a layperson can actually practice Buddhism, because we're in right resolve. We're in right resolve. And in both in MN 54 and MN 75, the Buddha is really clear that sensuality, it doesn't nourish. And he's talking about anyone who might take nourishment from fire is already incredibly afflicted. Afflicted so much so that it is a relief. It's a distraction from what they're afflicted with. If your body is weeping and bleeding with itchy sores, that fire might be a wanted distraction. And so humans can get really stuck. They can get really stuck in wanting things. Listen to what Robot had to say. The mind is like sick skin. It mistakes pain for pleasure. And for the wise 5-year-old, when you're very, very hungry or itchy inside, you can think bad things are good, but they never make you full and they never make you better. And that's the teaching. That's the teaching, I think. And again, my opinion as a householder, as a layperson, as a non-monastic, and the argument as to whether or not a layperson can truly practice, the label Buddhism, I have no idea. All I can really speak to on that front in relationship to is in relationship to myself. That how do I work with sensuality and sensual pleasure as a layperson in my own life? I don't live like a monk. I just, and I'm by no means perfect by any measure. I've talked a lot on here about how not perfect I am. But I use the Eightfold Path, the ideas that we're exploring in this book, and that we'll continue to explore until the end, as a compass, as a, I don't know what, as an anchor, to anchor my ship. It's not really so much about being perfect. I'm fundamentally not perfect. I couldn't be perfect if I tried. And I used to try, and I don't really try anymore. It's much more about intention. And I think that's why, oftentimes you'll hear people say right intention rather than right resolve. The original idea, my understanding, I could be wrong. Again, there's so many different, it's 2,600-year-old stuff here, it's not like it was ever written down either. But that might be a word that's more easily accessible, in the West, at least it's, this idea of, am I intentional? And sometimes we're not. Sometimes I know that I can get triggered, and in that moment, I forget, or being intentional becomes unavailable to me. And then it becomes a matter of, finding tools and working with the disciplines of this particular practice to assist me with being intentional, We all have our metaphorical sores that smell awful. So it's not about becoming this pristine babe. It's much more about, okay, right resolve, right intentionality. Okay, well, at any rate, I know I'm way over time here, so I'm going to wrap that up. So that was my take on all of that. And we will continue on with all of that, I might add. We will continue on in right resolve in the next week or so. Yeah, it just kind of depends. It's probably going to be more like 2 weeks before I can drop another one. But thank you so much for continuing to listen if you're still here. And, if you've been listening for a while, thank you. And I hope you got something useful from it that is of interest to you, or that you'd like to explore about where our happiness is really coming from. But again, thank you so much, and take good care. Be well. Bye.